Fortress is the newest addition to the long list of temporary game modes added to Battlefield 5 that soon will no longer be playable and available to the public. That of course is a major point of contention within the community, with around, at least amongst my viewers, 2/3 of the Battlefield players unhappy with the way DICE currently just removes new game modes after only a week of playtime and doesn't just leave them in for us to enjoy until all eternity. Now of course there's some arguments and reasons why DICE does this, and the whole issue is a little bit more complex, and thus in this episode of Fixing Battlefield I wanted to go into not only the pros and cons of these temporary game modes and the way they show up and then just disappear again, but also some of the misconceptions around them and possible solutions and fixes that could ease the community anger somewhat at the disappearing of some of their favorite game modes. Now I may hate Grind and Fortress and love Squad Conquest, but for a different player he may hate Squad Conquest and love Grind, and that's the fundamental problem at the root of removing these game modes. You're eventually going to piss off everybody, because everybody's going to like at least one of the game modes if you introduce say 10 over the life cycle of Battlefield 5, and are going to be disappointed when they disappear. That's not, however, to say that this isn't with reason, because if you add an infinite amount of game modes or a numerous amount of game modes and you keep on leaving them in the game, well, eventually they're actually going to be unplayable because too many players are going to be spread out between too many different game modes. In other words, you lose the freshness factor and you also make it very difficult for players to actually play the game modes they enjoy because everybody's spread too thin. This was one of the major problems and reasons why Firestorm Duos was recently removed from Battlefield 5 and added to the long list of temporary game modes currently no longer playable. It's also one of the reasons why Squad Conquest made a return, at least for now, because the player numbers were high enough to support it, but if that changes, DICE has already said, then the game mode will once again be removed. Now, one of the problems, of course, with this temporary nature of the game modes is the effort that DICE then can put into actually producing them. They're only available on 2 or 3 maps, depending on which. Squad Conquest now is on 4 maps, and the polish is significantly less in terms of balance, in terms of map design and alteration to fit the individual game mode. That's not to say that the base game modes don't have maps on which they are relatively unenjoyable. Frontline's Hamada is a great example. The number of breakthrough maps don't work on certain sections very well either, but this is especially true of course for the temporary game modes. They are somewhat of course also a testing bed for new features and new types of combat that could be made into full-scale game modes or added to future iterations of the Battlefield franchise. And that on one hand is a good thing. The lack of polish of course is a little bit of a bad thing. Playing the new Fortress mode when it came out, it's relatively obvious that the positioning of, for example, health and ammo stations paired with the lack of team play in your average Battlefield game mean that the attackers are at a massive disadvantage in these game modes compared to the defenders, more than even in Frontlines and Breakthrough, which already suffers from a very strong defender bias, meaning that defenders are more likely, statistically at least as far as I've been able to measure, to win a game of Breakthrough than the attackers, meaning of course the odds are stacked against you if you start off on the attacking team. So the last amongst the good reasons for having these temporary game modes in the game is that it actually fulfills certain niches that maybe only small parts of the community like to play, but wouldn't usually, because DICE can't put in the effort to design an entire game mode on 7-8 maps if only say 15% of the player base are actually going to play that game mode. If they do that however on just 1 or 2 maps for a temporary event, that's a lot less work and they can get away with it. Now certain game modes may be a little bit more niche or less niche than DICE actually anticipated. I think Grind was a massive success, at least from the community outpour demanding it to return, so it seems. The same of course is with Squad Conquest, but the point remains nevertheless. This allows DICE to serve individual groups within the Battlefield community with their specific ideal game modes and ideal playstyles without necessarily putting so much development time into these that it negatively affects the remainder of the community who, for example, don't like the more chaotic Metro locker style gameplay that you find on Grind or Fortress. But with some of those good reasons then for why we have the temporary game modes in Battlefield 5, including the freshness of the content, being able to try out new things, and serving niches amongst the community, there is of course some clear downsides. And the big and obvious one is that you end up upsetting a large portion of the community every time you then remove said game mode. But also of course the lack of polish is something to consider. And the last point that I want to make, actually a misconception if you ask me, is that it takes away development time from introducing new maps, new features, new vehicles, new weapons and content, or just improving the general state of Battlefield 5, say netcode or lags or stability, for the sake of introducing new content that will only be played for 1 week. As DICE has made clear on multiple occasions, These are actually different teams working on different content. In other words, if DICE wasn't dedicating 1 or 2 or 3 people or even teams to coming up with, say, the grind or fortress game mode and implementing it, those teams would not be creating new maps or new content for the base game or even fixing technical elements that currently don't work as well as they should in Battlefield 5. They would essentially be doing nothing or working on a different game. So that is somewhat of a misconstrued argument, but it's understandable, of course, why people would think so. With the pro and con arguments then surrounding why we have these temporary game modes in Battlefield 5, what we need to talk about is, of course, how DICE could improve the situation. Because that is the staple of any Fixing Battlefield episode, how DICE can do better to satisfy the community. And in my opinion, there is actually a couple of relatively simple things they could do without destroying the whole concept of having these temporary game modes. Because, as said previously, they serve a very clear purpose, and you can't just introduce an unlimited amount of game modes and diffuse and dilute the community base across all of those different experiences. Now, one of the great ideas that I've heard mentioned and that I agree with myself is to have one of these temporary game modes, now especially that we have multiple of them, featured every week. No matter if you're introducing a new one or not, every week you can either play Squad Conquest, Grind, Fortress, Rush, or Duos in Firestorm. Now, Squad Conquest is now a permanent game mode. If that stays so, that will be out of that list, but if it would go back to temporary, that's the way you would handle it. And every few weeks then you add a new map of the existing maps to one of those temporary game modes to give a person a reason also to jump back into Grind or jump back into Rush to enjoy a slightly different experience. I think this would be a fantastic idea to keep these game modes regularly coming back, and this way people will be a little bit less upset about them going because they know, hey, in 3 or 4 weeks we're going to be able to play Grind again, and next week we've got this nice game mode that was previously not available directly replacing, instead of, as of now, essentially every 4 to 6 weeks we get a new temporary game mode that we play for 1 week and then we go back to playing the vanilla game modes because nothing else is available. That's slightly less ideal of a situation. Also, and this is somewhat in addition, not necessarily instead, I really do think DICE needs to collect feedback on these individual game modes in-game. So say if this week we have Grind available, or actually for a matter of fact we have Fortress available, why isn't there a little kind of field on the home screen that pops up once you've played 3 or more rounds of Grind, asking you if you like the game mode, yes or no, if you think it needs improving, yes or no, if you would consider playing it on different maps in the future, yes or no. Full stop, end of story. That way DICE can garner a little bit of feedback and a feel for how the community feels about these new additions and make changes accordingly before reintroducing it, say 3, 4, 5 or weeks later down the line. Also, maybe which maps you'd like to see on a set game mode would be another great way of keeping things fresh and keeping the community involved, because people do love being involved in the games they love and spend hundreds of hours playing. And then lastly, and this is a little bit more of a complicated one, I would admit, but will go nicely with the revamping of the entire game mode in the first place, and that is connecting it with grand operations. So yes, have these temporary game modes as they are now, but also replace certain game modes in certain grand operations with some of these temporary game modes, as we, for example, have a current grand operation surrounding Panzerstorm and Arras that ends in a Rush game on Arras. Rush is not available to play in any other form other than there right now, which is a bit of a shame, but at least you can play it there. And this would also keep grand operations a lot fresher. Say if there was always 2 different types of game modes that could actually result in your second map or first map of playing grand operations. I think that would keep things interesting, fresh, and somewhat unpredictable, and would make the grand operations a little bit more grand, including more elements of the Battlefield franchise and a little bit less stale and predictable as it currently stands right now. In the ideal world, arguably, you do all of these 3. You'd have the temporary game modes included in some of the grand operations, you'd have a different one of the temporary game modes available to play every single week, and you'd have voting and feedback in-game so that DICE can make changes accordingly. Whether this will happen is of course up in the stars and very unlikely, but at least some of these suggestions could ease some of the frustrations that most of the community feels surrounding the disappearance of some of our favorite or least favorite game modes on what seems like a weekly basis. That being said though, I'd love to know what you think about the temporary nature of some of the community's favorite and least favorite game modes currently in Battlefield 5, as well as, and more interestingly, the suggestions and possible solutions that could avoid some of the problems that making these game modes permanent would bring, but would at the same time satisfy the community. So leave that, as well as of course your usual feedback and video suggestions down below in the comments, or hit me up with them on Twitter. If you found this video interesting, enjoyable, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. But with all that being said, I'd like to thank you very much for watching, and hope to see you in the next Battlefield 5 video.